All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the 2022 SLU Summit for Water Resources in a Changing Climate. We're really happy to have you all here today. For those of you who have been with us all morning, thanks so much for attending. And for those of you just joining us, thanks for hopping on. We're excited to share some more exciting research presentations with you throughout the day. Kicking us off is Dr. Liz Hasenmueller. Liz is our Associate Director of the Water Institute, as well as an Associate Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences here at SLU in the College of Arts and Sciences. And today she will be presenting on freshwater salinization in critical zones. So thanks so much for being here, Liz, and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Rachel. I appreciate that, and it's good to see everyone again, virtually see everyone. I'm going to click my video off just to reduce potential technical difficulties, but I'm really happy to be talking to you guys today about freshwater salinization in critical zones, and this is nicely linked into the presentation that we heard before by Dr. Semyat. What I'm going to be talking about is issues of increases in salinity in freshwater systems in what we call the critical zone. Before I get started, I want to brag a little bit on our students here at SLU because this project is the culmination of work that's been done by several of my students throughout the past 5 or 6 years, including Heather Levin, who's now at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. She was one of my former Ph.D. students. One of our current students, Teresa Barraza, who is a current PhD student working on some of these topics, and then a former undergraduate student, Ashley Montgomery, who's now working on her master's degree at the University of Tennessee. So they really were instrumental in working on these projects and putting together this topic that I'm going to be talking about today. So what I want to introduce you guys to today is this idea of increasing salinity in freshwater. So we've observed in many locations that surface freshwater systems are getting saltier with time, and this has been well documented. But what my research interest is not just how do these surface water systems become saltier, but how does the entire critical zone system, which goes all the way from the tops of the trees down to the bottom of the groundwater, how is this entire system becoming saltier, and how does that relate to human activities? So the plot you're looking at over here is salt consumption over the past 120 years or so, where we can see this big increase starting in the 1940s of salt consumption in the United States. And that's largely related to using salt as a de-icing agent for the roads during the winter months. So in February, here in St. Louis area, if you're in the region, we had a lot of winter events where we were applying road salts to the roads to enhance the safety of our roadways during the winter. However, when we put those salts down to depress the melting temperature of ice and snow to keep the roadways clear, that has some unintended consequences because those salts that we apply on the road can later run off into surface water bodies. And we've seen this increasing issue of salinity in surface waters, but these salts do go other places. So here we're looking at a brining truck, and we know that some of that salt's going to go off into soils. It could potentially end up in our groundwaters. And so what I'm interested in is how this applies across multiple systems. But just to touch on this topic a little bit more in terms of what we know in freshwater systems at the surface, so we're talking about rivers and lakes, streams, and things like that, we've seen increasing saltiness of these waters over the years. And so this is a plot showing specific conductance, which is a proxy for how salty the water is, across times for a series of stream systems across the United States. And what we can see is that we have increasing salinity in all of these systems over time due to that enhanced application of road salt during the winter months. Relatedly, we also see increasing pH levels, or what we call alkalinization. So the streams are becoming more basic. The pH is increasing over time. And this is related to what we call human accelerated weathering, which is where our infrastructure like roadways, cement, concrete, these things weather, and it introduces chemicals into the water that make the pH higher. And we've noticed this in addition to the salinity. But focusing in on the salinity question, we see that freshwater salinization is strongly correlated with both the climate that we're talking about, but also the amount of impervious surface area in the region. So I want to talk a little bit about a study that looked at the concentrations of salt in surface water systems ranging from the southeast all the way up to New England, where we have increasingly harsh winter climates. And in these plots over here on the right-hand side of your screen, we're looking at annual chronic excedences for chloride. So this would be where we have relatively high levels for long periods of time, and then acute excedences for chloride, where we have very high periods of salt concentrations where chloride's very high in the system. And what we've observed is that as you increase impervious surface cover, you tend to increase the amount of road salt contamination because there's more roads that are being salted. And so we have that enhanced salinity. But we also see that as you move from more mild climates to more harsh winter climates, that you tend to enhance the salinity as well because you're applying the salts more. This particular system across the eastern seaboard that we're looking at is in a specific type of area where the rocks are not very similar to what we have in Missouri. So these rock types are made up mostly of what we call silicate minerals, which do not tend to dissolve very readily when water passes through them. So if we were to look at a cross section of these systems, it might look something like this. But if we turn to a place like Missouri, where we have what we call carbonate minerals, which include rocks like limestones and dolostones, these rocks dissolve fairly readily when you add a small amount of CO2 into water that's moving through these systems. So CO2 can dissolve into rainwater and it dissolves the rock, just like your dentist doesn't like you drinking soda because it's bad for your teeth. It has a lot of dissolved CO2. That's what makes it fizzy. The same thing on a much slower and more minor scale happens to these rocks. And in Missouri, we end up with a unique system called Karst, which has these holes in the subsurface, including caves, springs, sinkholes, things like that, that help us move water really quickly through the subsurface. So if we have salt that we're applying up at the surface, that salt potentially can move much faster through our groundwater system because of these open void spaces. And so what we wanted to understand is how road salting affects these types of carbonate systems and if they're more vulnerable to freshwater salinization than other types of lithologies like I was showing over on the East Coast in that study that we saw before. So my research group has spent the last several years trying to understand what are the mechanisms, pathways, and timescales of freshwater salinization in these carbonate systems that have these void spaces where water can move very quickly, but also where water can move very slowly through the rock matrix as well. And so we not only want to understand how freshwaters at the surface are getting saltier, but how is that road salt that's applied to the road moving through our soils, and once they get into our soils, eventually moving into our groundwater aquifers, potentially passing through these slower flow paths or moving rapidly through karst conduits or cave systems, basically caves that have these flowing stream systems and reissuing up at the surface. So this is a spring system where we see groundwater coming back up on the surface. So the way that we set out to do this was a series of different types of experiments and sampling techniques in order to understand how salt is moving through these systems. So we sampled in the field, we collected soils, we collected water samples. We also collected samples to bring back to the laboratory to do experiments. So we collected intact soil cores from places near roadways to see how the salt was moving under controlled conditions in our lab. And we did geochemical analyses to understand what the chemistry of these different materials were, and with specific focus on sodium and chloride because that's what makes up most of our road salt, regular old table salt. And then finally, we put all this together and looked at the long-term trends across the past few decades to understand how concentrations are changing with time. So to give you some background on where we were conducting this experiment, we were looking at a site called the Rockwoods Reservation, which is about 40 kilometers west of downtown St. Louis. And we were specifically focused on a spring system called Rockwood Spring, which you can see here in the background. This is the spring with water, groundwater issuing from that spring. And this is the recharge area. So this is where water drains to that spring system. So this is a location near St. Louis, and this system features these carbonate rocks with soils sitting on top of them. The system's dominated by forest, as you can see in this aerial photograph over here, and there's a main road that runs through the property that's regularly salted in the winter months. So we can look at how that road salting impacts both the soils, but also the groundwater system as well. To get us started on the data that we collected, we went out and we took soil cores for laboratory flushing experiments to figure out how long it takes road salt to pass from the road and through these soils, and then potentially be delivered deeper into the system, into the groundwater and things like that. So this is a picture just showing how we collected those. So here's the roadway. Here are cores that we collected to take back to the lab. And then here's our experiment where we have these soils and we expose those soils to different types of treatments. So we had 3 separate types of treatment. One was a control group where we just passed pure water through the system, so deionized water that was free of ions that could be related to road salting. Then our next group was what we called the salt group, where we just put a lot of really salty water through these soils. So this was very, very concentrated salt solution that we poured into the top of the core, and then we collected the water that came out at the bottom and looked at the difference between what we put in and what we got out of the system at the bottom. Our last group was what we called the recovery group, and this was a series of experiments meant to mimic what actually happens during the course of the year. So in the winter, we have road salting, so runoff from roads is going to be fairly salty. And then as time progresses, the runoff from roads gets less salty as we get into the spring and summer months because we're no longer applying those salts to the roads. So this was meant to mimic what's happening in the natural system. So we looked at these 3 different types of waters and how they move through the soil and what the end results were. And what we found is shown here in these plots. So these plots are showing the water that came out of the different soil cores. So we're looking at the water that passed through, and we're looking at how that water compares to what we were putting in. This top plot is showing chloride, so that's one of the components of road salt. So we have sodium and chloride. And this is for that deionized water, which was the relatively pure water that we're putting through the system. And chloride concentrations were unsurprisingly very low. So if you look at the scale, we're talking about less than 1 milligram. If we then look at the treatments that had salts in them, our salt group over here has much higher, orders of magnitude higher concentrations of salt, which is what we would expect if we're pouring salt water through these soils. Salt concentration was always much lower coming out of the core than what we were putting into the core. And we can also see that happening with our recovery group where we had this initial spike in saltiness, and then that goes back down over time as we start flushing the core with the pure water in the system. Over here, we're showing something similar for sodium. So all 3 of them are plotted together. This is the DI water, this is our salty water, and then this is our recovery group. And the only thing to notice here is that the concentrations are much lower than what we saw with chloride. What we were observing in our system is that when we initially irrigated these, we weren't seeing as much salt coming out as what we were putting in. So a lot of the ions were actually sitting in the soil and as pore water. So the water passed through and kind of stuck in the soil. And by the end of the experiment, we were only able to recover or about 75% of our chloride and about 50% of our sodium. So sodium was sticking in the soil much more readily than chloride was sticking in it. What we calculated when we looked at these trends is that we saw that during the course of our month-long experiment, our recovery group never got back to normal. There was always elevated salt concentrations compared to our control group. And when we did the calculations, what we found is that the recovery group would take 3 to 5 months in order to get that back down to those baseline concentrations. We were also observing that not only when we did this experiment that we were flushing salt through the system, so sodium and chloride, but we observed that other types of ions that we didn't put into the core were coming out of the bottom, which means that the salt was displacing other stuff in the soil and ended up coming out in what we call that leachate passing through the core. So now I want to turn from our laboratory experiment to some of our observations in the field. And so when we went to the field, what we did is we collected bulk soil samples. So that just means we collected a scoop full of soil from the sites. And we did that at increasing distances from the road. So we started up close to the road and then we moved further away from the road, collecting soils to see what they looked like. Then we also collected the water that's sitting in the soil. And so what we did is we used a suction lysimeter, which basically you apply suction to this tube that's sitting in the soil, and that tube sucks in water. And then we removed the water and looked at the chemistry of the water. And we had those placed in what we call nests, which are groupings of these lysimeters that are different distances from the road, and they were at different depths, ranging from 10 centimeters down to 50 centimeters. First, looking at what the soil chemistry looked like. So this is the bulk soil. We looked at the concentrations of sodium and chloride in our soil over time for a year-long period. This is work done by one of my undergraduate students, Ashley Montgomery. And what Ashley found was that when we looked at the concentrations of these ions over time, unsurprisingly, the biggest peaks in these ions happened closest to the roads and during the winter months. So we had this big peak in sodium and a much smaller peak in chloride, but that occurred during the winter. And as we went further away from the road in this direction, those peaks got lower and they got slower as we moved away. And with chloride, basically almost a non-existent peak. So what is this telling us is that sodium is sticking in our soil longer while chloride is moving very quickly through the system. Now turning to what was in the actual soil porewater. So this is the water sitting in the soil. And this is work done by my current PhD student, Teresa Barraza. What she was finding is that when we turn to these water samples, we also saw that as we looked at water samples closer to the road, which are the samples shown in the warm colors, and then cooler colors are showing samples further from the road, that unsurprisingly, when we were close to the road, salt concentrations, including sodium and chloride, were much higher near the road and decreased with distance away from the road. And we could see some variations as a function of depth. I want to show you these same data, but at higher resolution in this next slide. And I know there's a lot going on here, but I want to kind of walk you through what's happening. So in this first column, what we're looking at is sodium concentration. So this is the first part of our salt, sodium. And then in the second column, we have chloride. Each one of these rows is showing a different distance from the road, with A being closest to the road and D being furthest from the road. And down here at the bottom, we're seeing some of the weather data for the St. Louis area, which tells us about what the conditions were. These gray bars that you're looking at are road salting periods, and individual lines within that gray shaded bar are when we had applications of road salt at the site. In each one of these plots, you're looking at the porewater samplers, which are in the grayscale. So these are the dots that are either in black or shades of gray. And then we're also looking at the concentrations of either sodium or chloride in the spring. So we're right next to a karst groundwater spring, and that's what this red line is showing for comparison. We looked at the timing between our porewater samples, so the ones that were closest to the surface versus deeper in our system, to look at the timing of how salt was moving through that system. And what we found is that porewater moves very slowly through the soil, so it delays the transport of these ions to 1 to 2 centimeters per day. So the water passing through this soil is going very slowly. So the delivery of salt through the soil is being slowed down quite a bit. And this was the main process to move chloride through the system in our experimental design. When we looked at the difference between what was happening with chloride, which is shown over here, compared to sodium, what we found is that chloride moved through the system very quickly. So we had these big peaks right after road salting, and then the chloride concentrations went down very quickly. But with sodium, we had a peak right after road salting, and then the concentration stayed very high in the pore water, which again is implying that sodium is sticking in the soil more readily than chloride is. And if we compare that to what's happening with our spring, so these are peaks that we see in the spring is peaking at the same time as the soil pore waters are, which implies that there's some sort of quick delivery besides just moving through the soil, that the spring is rapidly getting these salt ions and it's not just receiving them through this slow process of transport through the soil. And I want to point out that some of the time we were seeing chloride concentrations that were above the EPA chronic toxicity threshold of 230 milligrams per liter in our system. To further emphasize that sodium was being moved through the system differently than chloride, I want to turn to this plot where we're looking at sodium concentrations plotted against chloride concentrations for the salt itself. So if we look at road salt, it's sodium chloride for the most part, and it's even, both of those ions are kind of evenly distributed in those then in that salt. So if we plotted what we would expect to see if just regular road salt was moving with the water, we would see a line that looks something like this. But both our pore water, shown with the open circles, and our groundwater, shown with the closed circles, are plotting below that line. So if we look at the concentration for 4 millimolar for chloride, we see that it's about half as much sodium being transported, which means that the sodium isn't moving with the waters as effectively. And again, implies that we have this enhanced retention of sodium in the soil. So the soil is basically causing sodium to stick in it, and it's not moving with the rest of the water like chloride is. We then compared both the seasonal and annual loads of sodium and chloride in our system to understand how long-term trends were happening with the road salting. So what we're looking at here is either sodium or chloride concentration, sodium shown in black, chloride shown in grayscale. The closed shapes over here indicate how much was applied to the system, and the pattern shapes indicate how much was coming out at our groundwater spring. And what we saw is that generally speaking, the export, so what was coming out of the spring, was much higher than what was going into the spring. And that seasonally, there wasn't a systematically higher amount of road salt being transported in the winter compared to other months. So you can actually see that in the winter, the transport is lower than in the spring and the summer. So there's this delay of the road salt in the system. What we also saw is that our sodium exports were always much lower than what we saw for our chloride exports, which means that sodium was being retained in the system. And so we saw about 25 to 30% lower annual sodium exports compared to chloride exports. The last thing I want to talk about is what this looks like over the long term. So here we're looking at data plotting chloride concentrations against time for our spring, as well as specific conductivity for the spring over time, which again is a proxy for the salinity. And on short time scales, what we see is there's a lot of scatter in the data. So this is because of flooding, this is because of seasonal effects. So we see a lot of scatter, but we noticed a significant increasing trend in both chloride and in conductivity over the past 25 years or so. And with chloride, we saw about a 1 milligram per liter per year increase in concentration in the system. So the spring is accumulating chloride compared to the amount that it's accumulating this chloride and then later releasing it is comparable to other systems that we've seen, including surface water systems. So you may ask, well, how do you know that this increase in chloride and this increase in conductivity is not because there wasn't more paved area in the basin, or we had harsher winters and people were adding more salt? Well, this kind of brings us back to the topic of our summit today. What we observed is that we have increasing winter temperatures in the area, with the implication that road salting should be decreasing over time. And there's really been no substantial change in the amount of paved area in the basin, so there shouldn't be more impervious surfaces that we're adding this salt to. So we feel that this is an increase because of what we call legacy salt ions that have built up in the critical zone in our soil, in our groundwater aquifers, and are gradually being released over time um, into the surface water systems. So in conclusion, and to kind of wrap all of this up, what we found is that there's certainly freshwater salinization, and it occurs all across these critical zone systems. So we were seeing salinization in our soils. We were seeing both the slow transport through the aquifer, which led to accumulation over year-long periods, but also rapid transmission of salt via sinkholes, which were those concurrent peaks in the spring and in our porewaters, where we had it rapidly ending up in our spring system. So we see this complex system where we have multiple flow paths, we have multiple transport processes, which imply that road salt can be accumulating and causing potential chronic toxicity problems, but also that it can be moved through the system very rapidly, causing acute toxicity problems. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and we have a few minutes for questions. But first, I do want to thank some of the agencies that have helped support this research, and a special thanks to Bob Chris at WashU for providing some of the historical data, as well as the many students who've helped in both the field and the laboratory. And so with that, I'll take any questions that you might have. So I'm just looking through the chat and not immediately seeing questions. What we found with this work that was pretty interesting was that there's really this interplay among systems. It's not just an isolated system. So I think that one of the things that's been particularly helpful with this work is that we've been able to see that soils can delay the delivery of road salt, that the road salt passes through groundwater systems at different rates depending on the configuration. We do have one question from Sally Zemmer. Is the work in which you found an exceedance of the nationally recommended chronic criteria for chloride published? Yes. So several of the art, pieces of information you're seeing here are published, and so I've added the citations under each one of these. So the one where we have the exceedance is this one over here, and that's published in Barraza and Hasenmueller, which is available on my website. So if you're interested in learning more about some of this work, several of these studies have been published and are available on my website. Any other questions about the work? If not, I really appreciate. Oh, I see Trish Riley from DNR sent one. She says, very interesting, Liz. We also assumed this was occurring by what we're seeing in surface water collections in urban studies. When compared to control streams, urban streams tend to maintain higher concentrations of chloride in water. And that's exactly right. One of the reasons that we moved to this study was to understand what was happening in surface water systems, because we were seeing these really elevated levels of both chloride and sodium in the summer months, and that would imply that there's some sort of storage in the system. And so we were looking for where that storage could occur, including soils and groundwater. One other question is, do you have any advice for a more environmentally friendly habit for winter treatment? Yes. Use less road salt. So one of the big things is the amount of road salt we apply. And if you go into commercial parking lots and other places like that, you see just so much salt put down. Really, to to effectively de-ice just a driveway, you need about a tablespoon of salt. And so using techniques like brining is one of the first things. One of our former students here at SLU, Danielle Hake, who's now at National Great Rivers Research and Education Center, published a study looking at a comparison between brining and regular road salt application, and saw a substantially lower amount of salt from brining compared to road salt usage. So that's one step. There are other types of systems that you can use, but one of the biggest things is just using less salt. I think that's probably about all the time we have for questions. And so I'll hand the mic back to Rachel.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz, for a great presentation. I know there are some questions we didn't get to, and there are some questions in the chat. So I'll ask anyone who hasn't had their question answered in the Q&A, if you want to go ahead and just put that into the general chat window. And then Liz, if you have any time to answer those in the chat window, that would be great. And if not, for anyone who has any remaining questions, please feel free to reach out to water@slu.edu, and we'll do our best to connect your questions to Liz for any future conversations around that. But thank you so much for your presentation.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end this session, and we'll be back in just one moment with our next research presentation. Thanks, everyone.